Terrorism unlawfully attacks civilian targets to achieve a political outcome. If the use of violence to achieve a political objective is the definition of war, then international terrorism can be considered a form of armed conflict. If this is true, how do just war principles and the law of war apply to states using military force in combating international terrorism? I'm Chris Mayer, Colonel, U.S. Cavalry retired, and in this series I explain the enduring philosophy of war as it was, as it is, and will continue to be regardless of advances in weaponry or politics. International terrorism is part of a strategy which targets the civilian population to achieve some sort of political objective. Now, these objectives could be revolution, secession, or independence of a region as a proxy for state-on-state warfare, or even as a separate campaign within a war, such as the French Maquis in World War II. Used in this way, terrorism changes from domestic criminal acts to a war form and should be treated as such. But if we treat international terrorism as a war form, then we must consider whether and how the laws and customs of war apply in fighting these terrorist organizations. We might begin by asking whether the laws of war apply at all. Now, my opinion, and remember that this is just my opinion as a retired combat arms officer and not a law of war expert, is that it can apply, sometimes, and in ways different than in conventional state-on-state warfare. The terrorist, by definition, is a criminal. This is inherent to the legal and common definitions of terrorism. In keeping with this, most national and international law treats terrorists as criminals, and terrorism should be opposed using means and methods limited to criminal law. When international terrorism becomes asymmetric or unconventional warfare, this may not be practical. Treating international terrorism as a criminal activity reminds me of a line from the movie Zulu. In response to the arrival of an officer from the Natal Mounted Police, one of the British soldiers remarks, "He's a peeler, come to arrest the Zulu." Obviously, that wouldn't have worked then, and it may not work now. Today's terrorists often rely on the constraints of the criminal justice system to avoid detection and capture, and, if captured, use the arraignment and trial as a platform for propaganda. When a terrorist threat exceeds the capabilities of ordinary law enforcement, states sometimes use military force. From an international law perspective, this is tricky. Using military force outside of a state's international boundaries is an act of war. To justify this act of war, the principle of jus ad bellum, or justice in going to war, must exist. These include being at the direction of a competent authority, a just cause, means and methods proportionate to the just cause, failure of peaceful means of resolution, right intention, and likelihood of success. Now, these conditions probably exist when striking a terrorist target, although I will bring up the likelihood of success in a later episode. Even when the conditions of jus ad bellum exist, there's international law to consider. Article 2 of the UN Charter prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Military action within the territory of another state without the permission of that state arguably violates this precept. Then there is the matter of international human rights law. We operate either in a human rights law environment or a law of war environment. A human rights law environment prohibits using lethal force against persons who do not present a serious and imminent threat to the life of or serious bodily damage to another. So we can't just shoot upon target identification as we can in warfare. A law of war environment requires an armed conflict to exist. Now, there are two types of armed conflict: international armed conflict, which is state-on-state warfare, and non-international armed conflict, which is war between a state and a non-state armed group. Good. So, using the means and methods of warfare against terrorists can be a non-international armed conflict. Not so fast. Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions describes this non-international armed conflict as taking place between the armed forces of a state and, quote, other organized armed groups which, under responsible command, exercise such control over a part of its territory to enable them to carry out sustained and concerted military operations, unquote. In other words, civil war or guerrilla warfare. I'm not so sure that we want to use this as a pretext to attack terrorists. Under this definition, claiming that a non-international armed conflict exists could justify the use of military force against a terrorist or other non-state armed group. However, it could also be a propaganda tool to legitimize the terrorist organization and its cause. That said, this definition may not be comprehensive. The United States rejected Additional Protocol 1 in its entirety, and the United Kingdom specifically objected to this definition, largely to avoid legitimizing the Irish Republican Army. So, we face the dilemma of using military force for combat in a legal context that doesn't seem to allow for combat. I think that most people would agree that attacking known terrorists and their support structure is justified. But what are the legal grounds for doing so? The answer seems to be in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. This states, "Nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations." The United States and other countries consider that this inherent right of self-defense could apply to any illegal use of force, including the planning and preparation of terrorist attacks originating from outside of the territory of that state. In the last 50 years, France, Indonesia, Germany, and Israel have each used this rationale to conduct anti-terrorist operations in foreign countries. The United States used this rationale to strike terrorists under Presidents Reagan, George H. Bush Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, Biden, and President Trump. Sometimes the foreign government supported this military action on its territory. Sometimes it did not. If we are using military force against terrorists, which body of law applies? The law of war or international human rights law? The answer seems to be both, or maybe neither, or at least not in its entirety. Regardless of the legal distinctions between international armed conflict, non-international armed conflict, or self-defense against an imminent terrorist attack, the principles of jus in bello, or justice in the conduct of war, will still apply as a moral imperative. This means, among other things, that only military objectives, such as enemy combatants, may be attacked, and the civilian population and protected objects may not be the object of attack. Jus in bello principles have, however, been complicated by authorizations for the use of military force passed by the U.S. Congress in 2001 and 2002, and which remain in effect. The key authorization reads, "The President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided in the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons." Now, this seems to expand restricting the use of lethal force from just enemy combatants to include civilians who may aid terrorists but do not actually conduct the terrorist attacks. And personally, I find this very concerning. It's also an open-ended check for the use of military force. Presidents of both political parties have used this authorization for military strikes against persons and places that had, in my own opinion, the most tenuous relationship with the 9/11 attacks. So, in summary, we can perceive international terrorism as a war form intended to achieve political objectives in a way that replicates the intended outcomes of war. In some cases, the domestic law and law enforcement mechanisms of a state are inadequate to react to or prevent terrorist attacks. In those cases, states might resort to using military force using the justification of national self-defense. Although terrorists do not meet the criteria of legitimate combatants and so do not have combatant privilege or immunity, neither are they protected as civilians under the law of war. Nevertheless, military forces attacking terrorists have a responsibility to conduct these attacks according to jus in bello principles. How that plays out in practice will be the subject of the next episode of The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare.